2013 was seemingly the height of zombies in gaming. Resident Evil 6 had just come out the year prior, along with Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 1 having just wrapped up its episodic releases. Call of Duty Black Ops 2 was running through its then current DLC cycle, just to name a few heavy hitters at the time. In the middle of all of these came along State of Decay. State of Decay was developed by Undead Labs, a studio founded by Jeff Strain, a former lead programmer from Blizzard whose prior work includes World of Warcraft, Diablo, StarCraft, and Warcraft 3. Strain & Co. originally envisioned State of Decay as a full online world, planning to transition into a massively multiplayer outing that brings the mechanical precepts of State of Decay into a much larger space for a considerably higher number of players. That vision of the game, however, was not reached with the franchise's first release. The version of the game we got is, as Strain himself put it, not a game about running through the streets, shooting zombies in the head, but to really capture that zombie survival aspect of the world and answer that question, what would I do? The game focuses on a community surviving in the early days of a zombie outbreak, placing the player in the shoes of almost any member of their group, making decisions for the health and survival of their party. The moment-to-moment gameplay revolves around third-person action, primarily exploring, fighting, and looting throughout the fictional Trumbull Valley, while balancing the needs and wants of their community in their evolving, declining world. State of Decay released to mostly positive reviews from critics at the time and sits at a mixed to above average aggregate score from audiences. The title saw 2 DLC releases pretty soon after the initial launch, that being Breakdown and Lifeline, and even received a Year 1 Survival Edition, a remaster of the game and expansions into one big package, releasing 2 years after the initial release. While the game was undoubtedly a success for a smaller studio like Undead Labs, selling 250,000 units in its first 48 hours and doubling that in just another 2 weeks, I find that people often forget about the original State of Decay. You won't see it on anyone's top 10 list for the time, the console generation, or even the Xbox Live Arcade. And yet I could never shake this game. As a 13-year-old playing the game on my friend's Xbox at a sleepover, I was immediately enthralled. To my teenage mind, the game delivered on the what would I do premise in an apocalypse setting, placing the title in a different echelon of zombie games in the then already oversaturated market. I've always thought fondly of the nights I spent playing the game with my friend, taking turns between days or character deaths, arguing over where to build our new base and what to build in it. So with that, I want to finally take another pass at State of Decay today, with my slightly more developed brain that's able to form a thought past zombie game equals good game. I want to take a closer look at what made State of Decay leave a permanent stain on my memory, and find out if it deserves that place in my heart.
Holy shit, man! Holy shit!
The story in State of Decay is, without a doubt, the weakest part of the game. It exists as a backdrop to the core gameplay loop of exploring, combat, and some radiant missions thrown in to give some variety to that exploration and combat. Regardless, the story persists throughout the entirety of the game. It has a beginning, middle, and end, so I guess it's worth going over. Starting from the top, the player is dropped right into the action in the shoes of Marcus Campbell. The very first thing you see is Marcus's friend, Ed Jones, grabbing a zombie so that the player can finish it off. The player is instructed to fight off the zombie through some tutorial prompts, and the two begin talking about how weird things have gotten while they've been on their camping getaway. They decide to start looking for somewhere safe in their campgrounds, or at least look for some people that haven't lost their minds, and they meet a group of guys in the ranger station nearby. The only noteworthy one among them is Thomas Ritter. I only know his name because I looked it up on the game's wiki page. He tells you to survey the area and look for supplies. While Marcus and Ed head outside to do so, the player will hear a gunshot nearby. Following the gunshot, the player meets Maya Torres. For some reason, people online really like Maya. I mean really like her. Of the total number of mods changing models in the game, 13 of 25 results on Nexus mods are focused on changing Maya's appearance. So take that as you will. After beating off some moaners. I can't leave that in. Fuck it. Maya joins Marcus and Ed as the player's newly, slowly forming group. Upon returning to the ranger station, the player's group finds the station crew dead. While checking one of the bodies, Ed gets bitten by one of them, newly reanimated into a zombie. The three survivors decide they need to get out of the area and head into town. On the way out of the campgrounds, Ed reveals he took a radio from the deceased Thomas Ritter. That radio suddenly gets a call from Thomas's daughter, Lily. The survivors don't disclose that Lily's father is dead, but make plans to meet her at a church on the edge of town. Arriving at the church, Ed looks feverish and Marcus is told that Ed may have to be killed to protect others. Marcus offers to look for medicine to buy Ed some time, and the player is instructed to meet Sam and Alan at a nearby clinic. The player and company loot some medicine and head back to the church. It's revealed here that Lily has lupus. If you don't know what lupus is, you're probably watching the wrong video, because I'm not here to explain autoimmune diseases. But this puts her in a position to be our permanent guy in the chair. Lily acts as our radio operator throughout the game, notifying the player of new objectives, things going on around Trumbull Valley, and occasionally giving advice to the player regarding their situation. Following the clinic run, the player is officially established into the group at the church, and the introduction/tutorial is officially kind of over. Spoilers, I guess, from here on out in the story section of the video. I don't know who would care about the story in an 11-year-old zombie game. The story's not very good, but I'm sure there's one guy that will really care, so this is for you, one guy. There's probably a time code on screen now for you to click. So you're welcome. This was for you. The player is now given some free time between main objectives to explore the town Spencer's Mill. You can clear hordes and infestations, gather up supplies for your new base, level up some skills, or meet nearby factions. After a while though, Lily will phone in about a rumor. The military is said to be rolling through town. Lily suggests a member of the military is sent to meet them, and the player has the option to change characters to Maya, a veteran, to meet with the army. If you do choose to meet them as Maya, some additional dialogue is present between the sergeant in command and Maya, stating they have some history together, though nothing is changed or added. After this encounter with the army, the player is set loose again. After some time, Lily's brother, Jacob, will call on the radio and ask for some help. He is holed up with Eli Wilkerson, and he needs help clearing out some encroaching Zeds. Lily makes it clear that the Wilkerson family should not be trusted, but asks the player to go help her brother anyways. After doing so, Lily calls again and informs the player that she's located a doctor, Doc Hansen, but he's on call at the Wilkerson farmhouse. The player is asked to go meet him to ask him to check on Ed. Upon arriving, the Wilkersons say that the doctor is busy, and that they need the player's help in defending their home from an approaching horde. This begins the first defense section, and once completed, the player and their community earn the trust of the Wilkersons. The doctor agrees to check on Ed and determines he'll be alright. Again, the player has some time to kill until the next story event. Soon, the player will encounter a group of soldiers rounding up civilians outside of a house, ready to execute them. The soldiers decide that the civilians aren't worth the time and let them go. The next time the player enters the home site, Lily and Jacob are arguing. Jacob wants to find a new place to hunker down, while Lily accuses him of wanting to run off again. This argument starts a mission to scope out a new potential home site and sends the player with Jacob in tow to a new town, Marshall, which begins what I am considering to be Act 2 of the story. Entering Marshall, Jacob has a house in mind for the new base of operations. When you arrive, a sick man comes outside, but not quite zombie sick, more like plague flu sick. He coughs a bit, then turns into zombie sick, and you shoot him. I decided I didn't want to live in the house where a sick dude just shambled out of, so I opted to look for another home. I vaguely remembered the base I had used when I first played the game over a decade ago, so I headed there and laid claim. After hanging out in Marshall for a little bit, the player will be contacted by a new survivor group, the Law. They're holed up in the courthouse in town and claim to be the last bastion of civility in Trumbull Valley, wanting to relinquish weapons from any civilians left and re-establish some order in these trying times. The player is offered to join them, but it is scripted that the player refuses, and the Law becomes a new friendly faction nearby. In addition to the law, the Grange introduce themselves to the player group as well. The Grange is a group of survivors living out of a garden supply store. They ask the player to help them find one of their missing members and later ask them to help guard while they bolster defenses at home. These two factions share a very brief, kind of out of place, intertwined story between Becca and Quentin, two members of the Grange, and Sheriff Carl from the law. Sheriff Carl visits the Grange and asks Becca, though calling her Alex, if he can talk to their group. Becca turns the sheriff away and Quentin questions why he was calling her Alex. This starts another mission from Quentin asking the player to inquire from the sheriff about Becca's past. He says that Becca, previously Alex, was a prostitute before the outbreak, but he feels she deserves a clean slate if that's what she wants. When the player reports back to Quentin, they are given the choice to tell him the truth or to tell him to talk to Becca himself. If the player tells him the truth, Quentin gets real upset about it and goes missing for a while. Becca will radio the player and ask that they look for him. When Quentin is found, Becca will call again saying that the Grange is under attack. When you get back to the base, they're all dead and Quentin asks to be left alone. After leaving the area, Quentin and the Grange will disappear for the remainder of the game. If the player tells Quentin to talk to Becca himself, he will go and talk to Becca, telling her he doesn't care about her past, whatever it may be, but he would like to know only if she wants to tell him. This option leaves the Grange available for supplies and Radiant missions for the rest of the game, though they have no more story content after this. Shortly after whatever outcome you decide with the Grange, Virginia Dahlgren, a character you can recruit back in Spencer's Mill, will contact the player saying she's received a message that there is a large group of zombies approaching the courthouse, where the law is operating out of. Lily suggests that the player check in with the law and help them if needed. When the player arrives at the courthouse, it's too late. The building is overrun and the player is asked to help save the remaining survivors, two of which ask to join the player's group. This concludes any story interaction with the law. However, like the Grange, they remain in the game for Radiant missions or supplies. While going through the town of Marshall helping the Grange and the law, Lily will contact the player about rumors she's heard regarding a group antagonizing survivors, extorting them for goods, roughing them up, that kind of thing. Lily suspects it's the Wilkersons and the player can go confront them. When confronted, they kinda just agree that they've been acting aggressively and tell the player, what are you gonna do about it? The player leaves the area and the Wilkersons are not heard from for a while again. Another bit of misdirection pops up in Act 2 in the place of Ray Santos. Ray is a former politician from Marshall and is rumored to have been kinda sketchy and corrupt. Ray gives the player a mission to deliver some goods to a distant survivor group with him, offering a sweet ride for the player to keep as compensation. While driving to the survivors, Ray started talking about driving haphazardly, drifting, and doing donuts on zombies' heads. I tried to see what he was on about, doing a sick drift myself, and I managed to flip my new car and fail the mission, not realizing my payment was essential for completion. This was the only mission I failed in the whole game. Thank you, Ray. You never see Ray again, but assuming you don't flip the car and you complete this mission properly, you unlock the ability to spawn new cars onto the map near the player. For the final side story in Act 2, at some point while you're stomping around Marshall, when you enter your base, a cutscene will start of Doc Hansen explaining to Jacob that Eli, one of the Wilkersons, has come down with a black plague and he passed away. Around this time, I noticed that one of my community members was sick with the black plague, Pastor William. This led to Lily calling me while I was out soon after, saying that Alan, another member of my community, has executed the pastor to protect himself and others from the spread of the plague. When you return to the base to confront Alan, he's making a case for himself, saying you can't be too careful around sick people anymore. Ironically, very soon after this, Alan gets the Black Plague himself. This leads to a mission where you choose whether to exile or execute Alan. I chose to mercy kill him and that was that. These were the only two survivors I ever lost throughout my playthrough, and I think this is a mostly scripted event based on what I've read online. So good for me, I guess. Finally getting back to the main story beats, the military can be heard requesting backup at a bridge up north, but their upper brass denies them any assistance. The player arrives and they accept your help, and here the player finally unlocks the last region of the game, Fairfield. With this, I am announcing that Act 3 has unofficially begun. After opening up Fairfield, the player gets a request from Lily. She wants a memento of her father, and has an idea for one if you can return to where he died, a watch she gave him for his birthday. Essentially, she's asking the player to backtrack to the very beginning of the game, the northernmost area on the map. I begin the long drive there, and retrieve the watch after one of, if not the most difficult fight in the game so far in the ranger station from the opening of the game. It's been flooded with zombies and has a high chance to spawn special infected, which we'll talk more about later. While we're out this far north, Lily gives the player a call about a survivor in need of help. When you arrive at the scene, the Wilkersons are seemingly holding up a survivor, and the player is given a choice to pay the survivor's debt or leave him to the Wilkersons' aggression. This led to a lengthy back and forth between my home site and the Wilkerson base to deliver some ammo on the survivor's behalf. Immediately following this, a Wilkerson brother is magically at your home site, even before you can get back. He asks you to broker a deal between the Wilkerson family and the previous survivor group, asking you to escort the survivors to a meeting place. Upon meeting the survivors, you can tell them that things seem sketchy and that they should back out of the deal. This ends the mission here, nothing happens between each group ever again. However, I didn't think the game would have any real consequences, and I just continued on with the mission. Driving the survivor to meet the Wilkersons ask the player to leave once the survivors have been dropped off. Upon leaving, the player will hear some gunshots and will be notified that the survivors have died. Whoops. This group of survivors is created and deleted within these 3 missions. They don't have any interaction with the player past these missions. They wouldn't have any sort of relation with the player for the weight of their deaths to mean anything. I can't even tell you the name of their survivor group if they had one. So I guess there weren't any real consequences either way. There's an easy opportunity here for this survivor group to be a community that the player has the most trust with, making the weight of losing them more impactful. This could have been the Grange, or the Law, or an early neighbor that you interacted with. So maybe it's a group you're familiar with, maybe you've helped them in a mission, maybe you've delivered supplies to them. But no, this line of missions decides to create a group and delete them all for the sake of this quest line. The Wilkerson storyline is done after this as well, so either way, none of this mattered, and it just feels kind of bizarre. After those super quick and fun road trips, the player will receive a call from the military, from Sergeant Eric Tan, with whom we made acquaintances with when he was ready to murder innocent people outside of their home. He asks the player to meet him in a safe house in Fairfield. When you enter, Sergeant Tan is standing over a wounded and diseased soldier. The wounded soldier is rambling about needing to leave Trumbull Valley, saying that the water is contaminated and it isn't safe to live here anymore. After the soldier seemingly passes away, Sergeant Tan asks the player to leave the home so he can execute the soldier before he turns. Tan exits the house and tells the player that he's heard about the water being contaminated and wants to check it out for himself. The player and Tan head towards the reservoir in Fairfield, and sure enough, the water is full of dead, rotting bodies. While traveling with Tan, he sure seems to be coughing a lot. Hope that doesn't lead to anything bad. Tan suggests that the player and their people leave Trumbull Valley, that he might know a way out and that he'll be in touch once he finds it. Tan very soon after gets back in contact with the player, telling them to meet him at the northernmost point in Fairfield. There stands a large concrete barricade, blocking the only exit out of the valley. Tan explains to the player that the barricade has to be blown through. It can't be climbed or broken by hand. He tells the player he knows where to get explosives needed, and once again he'll be in contact soon. Tan's a man of his word. He gets back to the player about where to find explosives, a makeshift armory at the Fairfield Fairgrounds. Lily, overhearing the conversation on the radio, mentions to the player that she's heard reports that the fairgrounds are swarming with infected, and they are swarming with infected. The player and Tan, along with a few soldiers that Tan is still hanging around with, fight through the infected at the fairgrounds in the biggest, most climactic fight in the game. There are dozens of zombies, the most the main story will ever throw at the player. There's a ton of special infected, and it genuinely was an intense fight. At the end, Tan secures the explosives and tells the player he'll have them set up at the barricade soon. One last time, you get a radio call from Sergeant Tan, and he's ready to blow up the barricade. A pretty difficult defense section ensues, and after a while, Tan tries to detonate the explosives with no luck. Tan explains that the detonator must be busted, so the bomb has to be ignited manually by hand. Lily tries to offer herself to be the one to manually set off the bomb, since she has a chronic illness. However, Tan pushes back by saying he has a terminal illness. Turns out that coughing was the Black Plague, who knew? Tan approaches the bomb and detonates it, killing himself in the explosion. The player approaches the new hole in the wall with Lily, and frankly, things don't look good. There's charred corpses on the ground, cars and trucks piled up in the road, there's an active fire burning in one of the shells of a truck. Lily asks, "What do we do now?" To which Marcus, who I was playing at the time, replies, "We get to work." And the game fades to the credits so fast it seriously gave me whiplash. And that's the end. That is an extremely verbose recap of an extremely bland husk of a story. There's hardly any real interaction between characters, thanks in part to the player being able to occupy any number of characters at any given time. There isn't really any character development of even the scripted set-in-stone characters. I guess you could make an argument for Sergeant Tan, but it seems more like a man sacrificing himself since he's sick. There also isn't really any resolution to the story. We're left in the dark until a post-launch update for State of Decay 2 dropped. Oh, spoilers. There is a sequel to State of Decay. As if that isn't like publicly available knowledge. If the narrative in State of Decay is the weakest component of the game, then the gameplay is thankfully the strongest. Like I said at the top of the video, State of Decay puts the player in the shoes of a member in a community at the start of a zombie outbreak. The core gameplay loop consists of third-person combat, exploration, and looting with some light base management. These systems are kind of deceptively simple at the surface level, so I want to take each component of gameplay and break them down where we can so we can understand what we're dealing with. First off, let's start with our characters. Characters in State of Decay, both NPCs and playable survivors, each come with skills and traits. Let's take a look at skills first, since these are the largest, most gameplay-facing aspects of your character sheet. Every survivor in the game comes with 4 core skills: cardio, wits, fighting, and shooting. Each one of these skills improve while you perform their related actions throughout gameplay. You'll get a higher cardio level if you sprint a lot, you'll get a higher shooting level if you kill a lot of zombies with guns. Getting higher levels of these skills increase the respective stats and actions. Cardio levels increase your stamina pool. Wits decrease the time it takes a survivor to search containers while also making you quieter while searching. Fighting increases your max health and introduces some combat skills and weapon specializations, more on those later, while shooting reduces the amount of recoil you have while firing. They all work on a pretty straightforward, linear progression system, but once you get to the max level of each skill, you get to choose to specialize in that skill. There's a specialization perk for each core skill, except cardio that gets 2, and committing to one specialized skill locks you out from the other skill's special perks. For fighting, you can earn the Rage perk, giving you stamina back for each zombie you kill. For wits, you can make searching completely silent, move faster while crouched, and immediately get through locked doors. Shooting gets a bullet time, focus, aim mode where the world slows down but you aim at normal speed. And with cardio's 2 perks, you can choose to either make sprinting or combat actions consume less stamina. On top of core skills, there are personal skills, which can help make survivors feel more unique, and more importantly, they can also affect gameplay in meaningful ways. There are 3 skills I consider class skills: leadership, powerhouse, and reflexes. Leadership gives bonuses to the amount of trust the player gains with survivors. Powerhouse enables the survivor to be more aggressive and dominating in combat with new abilities, while also giving an additive benefit to carry weight and increasing how many consumables they can stack in their inventory. Reflexes is sort of the opposite of Powerhouse, unlocking abilities focused on avoiding damage and allowing the survivor to regenerate stamina quicker while controlling combat in a more defensive way through combat abilities. There's definitely a weakest option of those 3, huh? Leadership's trust gains cannot hold a light to the gameplay benefits of the other 2 skills. The trust mechanic in the game is not developed enough to warrant prioritizing playing as a character with the leadership skill over powerhouse or reflexes. Which is kind of a shame. It'd be interesting if you wanted to play as a character with a more charismatic playstyle, though the trust mechanic doesn't lend itself to any sort of gameplay or deeper mechanical depth. We'll talk more about trust later, but I kinda just wanted to get complaining about leadership out of the way. Aside from what I'm calling class skills, there's also facility skills. These skills improve the efficacy of facilities in the player's home site. These skills include things like medicine, construction, research, stuff like that will affect the corresponding facilities in your base. They can be increased and leveled up by utilizing the facility they're specialized in, but are otherwise stagnant until you put them to work. These facility skills can allow you to build higher tier facilities in your home site, and you can employ these skills to give temporary buffs throughout their associated facility. Rounding out personal skills, we have gag skills. These are skills to flesh out the survivors in a more personal sense. They give a little bit of behind the scenes depth to the survivors in your home site, but don't provide any sort of gameplay benefit. They include skills like sexting, computer skills, hoarding, or gossiping, to name a few. I liked looking at these when I got a new survivor cause yeah, they just add a little bit of depth to their personality before the events of the game. Finally, moving on from skills, there are traits. These fill out the character sheet in a much less meaningful way most of the time, but hey, a lot of them are fun like the gag skills, adding some personality or depth to the survivor, telling you what job they had or what they like to get up to before the outbreak. There are some useful traits that do things like adding additional levels to skills right when you get the character, or even increasing XP gains for certain skills while you're playing as the character, such as the cop trait or the fast hands trait, giving a level in shooting or increasing fighting XP gains respectively. Traits can also add facility skills like the engineer trait, giving you access to the construction skill. There are also negative traits. These impact survivors in a negative way, if you can believe it. These are like counters to the previously useful skills, stuff like the absent-minded trait, which will lower your wit's XP gain. I wouldn't necessarily avoid playing as a survivor with these traits, but if I noticed I ran out of stamina quickly or felt like I was weaker in combat, I'd usually chalk it up to a negative trait and confirm it later in my character sheet. And of course there are gag traits. Just like skills, these are more here to add some backstory to your survivors, such as the survivor's guilt trait, just giving them a little personality or again, a hint at what they were like before the events of the game. Another bit of what makes up our survivors is their attitude. The attitude stat affects their behavior and effectiveness in gameplay. Attitudes will be worsened when a survivor at your home site dies, if there's an event at home like an accidental discharge of a firearm, as well as being sick or injured for too long. Attitudes improve with things like clearing out nearby hordes or infestations, bringing home facility supplies, or helping out a community member on a mission. The attitude improvements only apply to the survivor you were playing as, at least I think that's the case, so it gives you a good reason to swap to some weaker survivors if they aren't feeling too happy stuck at home. There's a whole list of attitudes, and you'll see them change on the character sheet in-game, or you'll get a notification when an attitude updates positively or negatively. But the negative ones seem to be the only ones with any gameplay element. Negative attitudes left untreated or unaffected for too long can result in negative effects to the community. These can range from causing arguments, lowering the attitude of other survivors, and can even lead to survivors committing suicide or running away from your base, permanently locking them out of gameplay. Sometimes negative attitudes can quickly be remedied with a mission, if the player is prompted with one. These missions are usually quick bouts with the negative survivor, taking them out on a mission with the player with some really bad, canned, uneven dialogue between the affected survivor and the player. With attitudes, there's also injuries and tiredness. Both of these ailments come through in natural gameplay, and both are treated in pretty much the same way. Injuries come through taking a lot of damage over time or taking a large amount of damage from a more powerful single attack. You can treat injuries by making sure your home site has a first aid facility and letting the survivor rest there while you're not playing as them. Tiredness is a lot of the same. The longer you play as a survivor, running around, fighting, jumping, dodging, anything that costs you stamina will eventually lead to the survivor becoming tired. All you have to do is to let them sleep in base for a little while and they'll be back in action soon. There's also a trust mechanic in the game. I told you we'd talk more about it. Trust is built between both your community members and your neighbors in Trumbull Valley. Higher trust with members in your community lets the player take control of that survivor, while higher trust with outside communities gives you the option to recruit their members into your group. Trust is earned pretty easily. Just do Radiant missions as they come along and you'll build trust with everyone. You can lose trust if you play recklessly around other survivors, like driving too close to them or using explosives near them. Losing trust was never a problem for me, though unfortunately gaining trust wasn't either. Like I mentioned before when I talked about the leadership skill, trust doesn't seem to do much. I've already listed everything it does, so again, it doesn't really seem like there's much to the leadership skill. The trust mechanic seems to be an interesting holdover for something that was previously deeper in the game, but maybe I'm too hopeful about something that might have changed during development. Lastly, for our survivors, I didn't really know where else to put this, is that all survivors work on a permadeath rule. If a survivor dies, they are dead for good. There's no revives or reloading the game. It very quickly autosaves if someone dies. You could close the game before they actually die, but come on, where's the fun in that? All in all, I think the systems for survivors in State of Decay can lead to mostly interesting gameplay. Sure, the more you use each survivor, they all become a homogenized superhuman that can do everything needed to survive really well, but the journey to that point is different for each of them. Having a character with traits that affect their fighting can ask you to invest in shooting instead, making that character stand out from the crowd and potentially convince you to choose different specializations that fit their needs or personality better. I played through most of the game with Marcus Campbell, who you first start with, Maya Torres, who is the first person you recruit, Virginia Dahlgren, a survivor I recruited early on, and Jacob Ritter, whom you recruit through the story. Each of them started with different skills and traits. Marcus had the powerhouse and leadership skills, so I knew right away that he'd be great for melee combat and okay at meeting new survivors to build trust. Maya started with an increased shooting level early on and with a gun herself, so I gravitated towards specializing her in rifles. Virginia had the bad back trait, so I figured I could use her for some short-range supply and rucksack runs due to the encumbrance limit from the trait, but that she'd still be good to handle herself in a close-quarters fight. Jacob starts with higher health and stamina pools than most survivors, so he was an obvious choice as an all-rounder. With all of that, I think allowing characters to have flaws or be better than others at certain things lets the player connect with certain characters. I didn't want to lose Marcus throughout gameplay, and believe me, there were so many close calls, because I knew that all the time I had invested in his melee specialization with his powerhouse skill, he was an extremely heavy hitter no matter the situation. I knew I'd want to keep Danica Minocchio at home because she had medicine skills no one else did. These traits and skills compounded into creating memorable characters where I think the narrative had failed to do so. It's been over a decade and I haven't forgotten the name Marcus Campbell. Sure, he's the first guy you play as, but I knew he'd be the workhorse for my playthrough when I was thinking about replaying the game. I remembered how effective and powerful of a character he was. Hell, I didn't forget Jacob Ritter having strong starting health and stamina, so when I rescued him for Lily, I knew he was a great addition to the team. I even remembered Lily, the radio operator. She's one of the few community members you can never play as, but I remembered her unique condition in the game and where that put her mechanically in the community. I think the characters in this game are the strongest point in favor for remembering State of Decay. Again, not because of their writing or narrative depth, but because as the player you can create memories through their flaws and proficiencies. If you played this game, maybe you neglected Marcus the second you got new characters in favor for how someone looked, or maybe you ignored survivors' negative traits and tried to work through them to make them as capable as anyone else. I think that's where the mechanical depth comes from for this game, and I think it's one of the best aspects of playing or replaying State of Decay. As I've mentioned a few times before now, the main thrust of State of Decay is exploring Trumbull Valley and fighting through zombies to get the loot and materials you need to survive or want to expand. So let's take a closer look at how we do both of those things. Combat can be split into two, maybe 2.5 parts. First up, there's melee combat. Melee consists of 3 weapon types: edged, blunt, and heavy weapons. Attacking with the weapons consume the same amount of stamina per swing, but each weapon has a different attack speed, edged being the quickest and heavy being the slowest. Each weapon has a certain durability and a specific weight assigned to them, determining their usefulness right out the gate. Low durability weapons break easily and often, while heavier weighted weapons will count towards the player's overall encumbrance, so it's ideal to find a good balance between the two. Blunt weapons seem to be the most common you can find, ranging from 2x4s to candlesticks, but they rely on the player being able to follow up on knocking zombies down to finish them off with a final blow. They do tend to have higher durability than edged weapons though. Meanwhile, edged weapons always have a chance to decapitate without having to queue up a final hit. They're quick, letting you swap between targets fast and often. As mentioned before, they do break quicker and need to be replaced or repaired constantly. Heavy weapons tend to be, well, heavy, but usually have a higher durability tied to them, allowing the player to keep fighting for longer. They swing in large, slow arcs which can hit multiple zombies at once, but also leave the player vulnerable if they aren't placing themselves properly. Leveling up your fighting skill with melee combat increases your overall vitality, or health, and allows you to specialize in one of the melee classes of weapons. You can only pick one specialization per character. This includes ranged specialization, and the choice is permanent to that character. The melee specializations each increase the respective chance on hit effects. Edged weapons have a chance to decapitate, blunt weapons have a chance to knock down, and heavy weapons have a chance to trigger a mighty blow, which kills the zombie it hits and knocks down ones nearby. On top of the chance effect bonuses, you also get to pick a single special attack for each weapon type when you reach level 4 in the specialization. For edged weapons, you can pick between a slow charge instant decapitation attack or a low swinging sweep attack that leaves zombies vulnerable. For blunt weapons, you get an uppercut swing that will guarantee a knockdown on a single target, or a large sweeping backhand swing to potentially knock down multiple targets. For heavy weapons, you get a combination of both of the previous large area attacks, a sweep to trip and dismember legs, or a spin attack that will knock down zombies you hit. Here's where I want to talk about the half part of combat, stealth. Stealth seems a little underbaked in State of Decay. You can perform stealth takedowns when a zombie isn't alerted, allowing you to dispatch one zombie with an albeit fun, flashy animation. The zombie's awareness rely on sound and line of sight, so if you sneak behind them, you'll most likely be alright to get the stealth takedown in. You can also use bushes to hide yourself to get closer when you're in their field of view. Lastly, you can attach suppressors to your guns. They have limited durability and wear down with each shot, and while they do make the guns effectively silent to zombies, without a high enough aiming skill you won't be able to take them out from a distance far enough to stay out of stealth. And that's about it. Once you get noticed in a room by one zombie, they all know where you are, and it'd be more of a hassle to lose them and re-enter stealth than it would be to just start hacking and whacking. I used stealth a bit in the opening hour of the game, when I didn't have a specialization in melee and I was still stuck with blunt weapons, but it was quickly phased out due to having to fight larger groups of Zeds or there not being much incentive or opportunity to use stealth. It was occasionally fun to shoot down a horde from behind with a suppressor, but that doesn't really feel good or fun to do. They don't hear you at all and you just keep on marching behind them, dropping them one by one. That does sort of gracefully lead us into talking about ranged combat though, the other whole part of combat. Ranged combat has a few more weapon types than melee, those being pistols, revolvers, rifles, shotguns, and assault weapons. Leveling up your shooting skill gives you a number of universal benefits to using guns. Your movement speed while aiming increases, your reload speed increases, and you are more effective at clearing jams when your gun durability is low. Getting the shooting skill to level 4 allows you to specialize into one of these weapon classes, and again, you are limited to one specialization between ranged and melee. The ranged specializations are much less interesting and kind of unclear on what they actually do. For pistols, you can increase their rate of fire. I don't know why you'd want to do that when they already have so much recoil it can be hard to keep on targets between quick consecutive shots, but there you have it. Revolver specialization gets you increased stopping power. I think this means it will literally stop or push back zombies when hit. Sometimes they can shrug off bullets, but why aren't you aiming for the head at all times? Rifle specialization is a really fun one on PC, what I played through the game on. You unlock target snapping, the ability to instantly snap to a target's head while aiming. The more you level it up, the further distance you can snap to targets from. This ability does not work on PC. It has no input key with keyboard and mouse controls. I read online that if I plug in a controller, I would be able to target snap as expected, but I had already played through the entire game with keyboard and mouse. You might remember I mentioned that I specialized Maya in rifles during my playthrough. That was before I knew the skill was broken. Shotguns get a kill zone increase. I have no idea what that means. I think it means the effectiveness of the spread from a shot is more effective, meaning zombies will get swept up in a single blast in a wider area, but I could not confirm what the kill zone was referring to. Assault weapons get additional control for their specialization to control the recoil, which makes sense since I believe all of them are automatic weapons. Overall, I think the specializations in melee are a much better pick for most situations and probably every character. The ranged specializations don't give you as much freedom in combat or provide you with effective perks. Target snapping does sound effective, but again, it doesn't work on PC. Meanwhile, melee combat rewards you with fun and powerful perks and abilities for your weapon type, and frankly, melee combat is just a lot more fun for me. Switching between combos to hack through zombies, then scooping them up for a body slam, it just feels right in this game. I do think leveling and using firearms in general is effective. You get universal perks for all the firearms with the shooting skill, and if you can aim half decently to hit Zeds in the head, guns are extremely effective at clearing groups. I think it really boils down to personal preference, and if you can keep your firearms loaded with bullets of course. Both options are effective at clearing single targets and groups. It's up to you to decide if you want to be up close in the thick of it or a couple yards away with a rifle tagging heads. Speaking of your preferred combat methods and their efficiency, let's talk about what you'll be fighting anyways. The Infected. It took me 40 minutes and 33 seconds to bring up zombies specifically in a video about a zombie game. State of Decay separates Zeds into two groups, zombies and freaks, which I'll occasionally be referring to as the common infected and the special infected respectively. I feel like I'm saying zombie enough already in the script, so we gotta mix it up somehow. The common infected are the most common enemy you'll face in the game. They're your average Joe zombies, coming in every shape and size you can imagine. They're aggressive and tough to kill outright, only going down if you destroy the head, though they are very dumb and easy to dispatch when taking them on in small numbers. They do however gather in hordes, which the game qualifies as more than 5 zombies, and are pretty deadly when in a pack like this. With multiple coming at the player, it can be difficult early on to manage fighting more than a handful of zombies. I had a couple tough fights in the opening hour of the game because I overestimated myself and my survivor's abilities, but otherwise these guys are pretty standard zombie stuff. There isn't a whole lot to say about them. If you've played a zombie game or seen a Zed in any media, you get the idea. Where the infected get a little more interesting are the special infected, or freaks. I'm going to try and recount them in the order that the game tries to introduce the special infected, so we'll be starting with the Juggernaut. The Juggernaut is your typical heavy zombie variant. They are massive in size, possess a large health pool, and deal huge amounts of damage when they attack. I think they have the most attacks out of any special infected at their disposal. Starting off, they have a bull rush attack, where they charge over a short distance in order to bash into a survivor. You'll probably see this one the most if you're shooting at the Juggernaut. They have short-ranged melee attacks which can knock survivors to the ground, leaving them vulnerable for a moment. They also have a ground pound, smashing into the ground and causing a shockwave from their fists, staggering survivors and leaving them open for follow-up attacks. Lastly, they have what the game calls the accordion attack. This is a grab move the Juggernaut performs, grabbing the survivor by their upper and lower half, attempting to rip them into 2 parts. There's a chance the Juggernaut ends this attack early by biting into the survivor. Not really sure what triggers that though. The accordion grab can be an instant kill for survivors on low health, and it looks pretty gnarly. The first Juggernaut is probably going to be a bit of a challenge for the player. They don't react to taking damage like the other infected, and they can seemingly resist headshots until taking a few consecutively, which even then they only get staggered. Consistent damage, melee or ranged, between their slow attacks make it easy enough to knock them down. Next up on the freak chopping block, freak number 2 is the Screamer. The Screamer isn't a threat in combat themselves, however, as the name implies, they scream and draw in more infected, even capable of summoning more special infected if they hear the scream. The scream does stagger survivors briefly, leaving them vulnerable to nearby zombies, but it doesn't do much damage. Something fun I like about the design of Screamers, they always have their arms ripped off, which helps you identify them easily in a crowd, letting you dispatch them quickly when you begin a fight. They do have some basic melee attacks if a survivor gets too close, but again, they're mostly for pulling other Zeds into the fight, so I don't really have much else to say about them. They're easy to kill with headshots like every other zombie, and easy to whack with melee if you have to get close. For our next 2 freaks, I'm choosing to combine them into one little section. We have the SWAT zombies and the army zombies. Both of these variants wear body armor that prevents them from being sufficiently damaged from firearms, requiring the survivor to engage them with melee. That's really the only difference from these guys and regular zombies. I think the SWAT zombies are always slow walker type Zeds, while the army zombies can run like normal common infected. For the next freak, we have the bloater. They have big bulbous stomachs full of gas, meaning they're pleasant to look at and weirdly attractive. Jokes aside, they probably have the creepiest design of our freaks. Their stomachs bulge out from underneath their skin, peeling back the flesh around their new pocket of gas. They don't directly attack survivors, instead choosing to blow up once they're close enough to their target, immediately dying but leaving behind a toxic fume. The gas they create lingers in the air, creating a cloud that damages survivors over time and saps their stamina when in contact. I think it also gives you a chance to get the Black Plague, but I'm not sure, I didn't encounter that myself. You can pop bloaters from a distance if you shoot their stomach, creating a cloud where they were standing, or you can just hit them in the head and avoid the cloud altogether. For the final freakiest freak, we have the feral zombie. These are the biggest threat in State of Decay. They move extremely fast on all fours and can pounce onto survivors, pushing them to the ground and battering them on the floor while opening the survivor up to other zombies joining the assault. They also have basic melee attacks which deal a lot of damage and stagger the survivor, allowing the feral to quickly follow up with another attack if the survivor doesn't recover fast enough. They have a higher health pool than most zombies, so taking them on in melee combat is kind of a death wish. They're able to quickly recover from knockdowns, and again, their melee attacks hurt a lot. It's doable with proper dodging and interrupting their attacks, but you don't have to do that to yourself. Thankfully, they will go down with a single shot to the head like most other infected. That rounds out our cast of enemies we'll be fighting throughout State of Decay. The game can throw mixes of the infected at the player in infestations and hordes, but it usually only throws in one type of special infected. With the exception of SWAT and army zombies, sometimes you'll see a few of those guys together. Common and special infected can also be found roaming freely throughout Trumbull Valley, by themselves or in groups small enough to not be considered an official horde. Again, they're pretty easy to manage in smaller numbers, but once you start taking on anything more than, I don't know, maybe 3, you'll start having problems, especially if some freaks are involved. Finally, moving on to exploration, the first thing I want to talk about are the 2 ways the player has to navigate the map. The first way we can get around is on foot. The player can go the entire game traveling on foot, probably. They'll be walking, sprinting, jogging, or sneaking. It's not an especially fast way to travel, but it is quieter and lets you move between buildings and alleys or climb over obstacles to cut off zombies in pursuit. Sprinting consumes stamina, and like I mentioned earlier, the more stamina you consume, the quicker your character can become tired and need to rest. While on foot, the player is also more open to looting, be it entering buildings, scavenging garages, or picking through orchards in a field. Each loot item takes up a single slot in the inventory. Now, speaking of the inventory, you only have 2 item slots with your character's pockets. This can bump up to 6 item slots with a small backpack and 8 items max with a large backpack. Both backpacks add to your overall encumbrance limit, and if you become encumbered, any action that consumes stamina consumes even more. On top of backpacks, the player could come across loot that must be carried in rucksacks. Rucksacks are required to carry materials, like medicine, construction materials, or food, and they can be carried regardless of inventory space. Once picked up, they exist in their own inventory slot, allowing you to carry 1 rucksack at a time. Now you might be thinking, 8 item slots max, with your weapons each taking up 1 or 2 slots, plus the item slots dedicated to consumables and maybe even a slot for the ammo for the gun you're carrying. Sounds like you're pretty limited on space. Yeah, you are. Thankfully, the player also has vehicles at their disposal for even more inventory space and, more importantly, a faster and debatably safer means of travel. Vehicles in State of Decay come in a couple shapes and sizes, though all of them being cars. You have old station wagons, pickup trucks, SUVs, and muscle cars to name a few. Of these vehicle classes, they don't have anything particularly interesting going on to distinguish them other than appearance. They do all have different stats, including durability, top speed, amount of seats, and storage space, though they all handle pretty awkwardly and break pretty quickly if you drive recklessly like I do. The only notable thing I looked out for when picking a car was the top speed or the appearance. I liked the look of the high-end muscle cars, and I favored them for their speed. Later in the game, I tried to use the police cruisers when I found them for what seemed to be the most versatile vehicle in the game, having a high top speed, 4 seats, and a lot of storage space. Other than that, if my car was in poor condition, I just took whatever was closest to me and drove that till it broke. You can leave cars in designated parking spaces at your base to repair them overnight in game, but I rarely needed to do so since there are so many cars on the map, and I didn't get attached to any I had picked out. It didn't feel necessary to repair them. Vehicles can help with looting and exploration, again due to their storage space in the trunk and their quicker means of transportation. Vehicles can have up to 6 item slots in the trunk, allowing you to place rucksacks or any other item in the trunk. They have no encumbrance limit, so you can stack anything and everything in those 6 slots. As I mentioned, vehicles are much faster means of travel than walking. I didn't time it or anything, but getting from one end of a neighborhood on foot might take you up to a minute or two, while driving down the street will only be a few seconds, even in the slowest car, the station wagon. The detriment of vehicles, however, is their noisy engines. Driving a car at all will produce a lot of noise, attracting zombies to the car and eventually pinpointing your location if you're not actively avoiding them. The zombies can latch onto the car and damage components, like knocking a wheel off or tearing off a door. They'll even eventually damage the engine, making the car unusable entirely. You have a little bit of defensive options while in the car, however. You can open the car door with the attack button and use it to slam into oncoming Zeds. You'll have to spam this action if a zombie latches onto the driver's side door. Unfortunately, if the other doors or the hood or the trunk get grabbed, you'll have to skirt by or drive into walls or slam the brakes to knock the Zed off the vehicle. Cars themselves are extremely effective at running down zombies, though damaging whichever part of the car is making impact with them at the expense of overall durability. Again, this seems like a non-issue with just how many cars are available on the map. In the early game, I frequently entered a car just to mow down a nearby horde, using the vehicle as a temporary tool solely for thinning out Zed numbers. I stopped doing that later on, in part because my characters were more effective in combat, but as I mentioned earlier, I started using police cruisers a lot more often and tried to keep those in alright condition if possible. While exploring, either by foot or in a car, you can come across survey points. The last bit of exploration I think I need to talk about. Survey points are, simply put, elevated platforms for you to look out on the surrounding area. When you're at the top of a survey point, you hold right click or left trigger and look around at the UI icons while you're in aim mode. This will highlight points of interest such as buildings to loot, vehicles or hordes, and special infected nearby. Surveying this way also adds these points of interest to your map in-game. It's effective to get to one of these survey points the first time you're in an area, even if you only survey partially just to see what kind of loot is around and vehicles you can grab. There's a lot more of these survey points than seem necessary. Sometimes there will be a multiple within a couple hundred feet of each other and their points of interest overlap. I only ever used surveying when I entered a new region for the first time because simply moving past areas will also add them to your map. Special infected and hordes will also get added to your map if they're becoming a problem for your home site or nearby friendly survivors. Surveying also pops up this progress bar when you're on the platform, and filling the bar can be kind of tedious. Having to hunt down for that last question mark icon in a sea of already discovered POIs just feels monotonous, though you do get some influence for finishing surveys, I think. Now that I've finally mentioned influence, this seems like a good time to move on from the core gameplay loops of exploration and combat. Now we can talk about the sort of pseudo-economy in the game, influence. Influence is the player's omnipresent currency for all player characters. It represents the player's presence in the community and is gained through a number of ways. The most obvious and convenient way to gain influence is by completing missions, be it main story missions or radiant missions that are given to you by your community or friendly neighbors. You can also gain influence by depositing items in your home site's supply locker, an ever-present supply box that houses all of your items between home sites and outposts. More on those later. Higher tier or more useful items will net you more influence when you drop them off. A gun is going to grant more influence than a wooden plank. Lastly, you can gain influence just by clearing out hordes or infestations on the map. So what do you use influence for? Well, taking things out of the supply locker is probably going to cost you influence most frequently. Again, higher tier items will cost more influence to take out, just like they give you more when you deposit them. You need influence to build facilities in your home site, as well as utilizing some of the facility abilities. You can also use influence to ask a community member that is considered friendly to the player to follow you as an AI companion. The AI companions are pretty effective. They'll hold zombies for you in place to finish them off, and their stats that you level while playing as them remain in place when they're just a follower. But I never really used followers since you still have to cover for them if they get into a bind, and they often get surrounded and get themselves grabbed, forcing you to help them frequently. Though I do want to mention specifically, followers have really good callouts for approaching zombies. They'll specify things like Z approaching at 3 o'clock, and you'll know exactly where to look. It's always relative to where you're currently facing. It's pretty neat and pretty helpful. You can also use influence for radio commands. Radio commands are abilities the player can employ that are available most of the game, going on varying cooldowns when used. They can be simple things like asking community members to come scavenge a building you're currently in or building new outposts away from home. They can also be more powerful abilities, like calling in an airstrike from the military or requesting cover fire from a sniper while you're out in the field. The cost of these commands vary, from only costing 10 influence to upward of 200 for later, more powerful abilities. I think the radio commands are alright as they are. Some are definitely more useful than others in the main campaign, like the medical advice command, which restores your current character from injuries, while others fall pretty flat for me. Like being able to spawn a new vehicle on the map seems pretty useless in the base game. You can outright lose influence through a couple of means as well, all of which I don't really agree with. Turning down missions from community members or friendly neighbors costs you some influence. And while I do think there should be a penalty for turning down missions, I think taking a hit to morale for community members or even changing their attitude would be a good alternative. For friendly survivors, I guess I would say lowering the trust of their community would work, but the hit to influence makes a little more sense here. For my least favorite aspect of influence, your influence can be up to outright halved each real-world day you log in, depending on the player's fame level. Fame is kind of a pointless measurement of your community's respect in Trumbull Valley. You gain it for completing missions and character progression. It doesn't ever go down and just rises throughout the game. Fame doesn't do anything but dictate how much influence you're allotted to have at the beginning of a session when you start the game. So, towards the end of the game, you're maintaining a higher influence thanks to your fame level, which is nice because you also have more radio commands and you're likely building new outposts, taking out higher tier weapons from supply lockers, and you're just going to be using more influence. But at the beginning of the game, it's just a big hindrance for what feels like no reason. I had a couple moments early on where I couldn't pull out some supplies from my supply locker because the game had just halved my influence since I had just logged onto the game for the day. I think smarter balancing of loot or giving a sense of progression with higher tier loot becoming available the longer the game goes on could have prevented the early game struggles you may encounter with fame. I really don't like the fame system, and it kind of drags down influence with it. Overall, I think the influence mechanics could be good, though the economy of it is extremely unbalanced. I think it's a good way to incentivize the player to do good and help out in Trumbull Valley. It's not exactly a currency, so you can't just trade your way through, coasting off high-end loot that would sell for a lot of money or something. It's meant to be a representation of how people think of the player, how much they respect you. There's even a line from Lily when the player has higher influence. She says something along the lines of you, being the player, having been helping out around a lot lately, and people wouldn't mind if you helped yourself to some of the better loot. Influence can be gamified a little bit by depositing a lot of high-end weapons or something, but you'd probably rather keep those weapons on your characters to use them. Again, I think the daily fame cutoff is a little too harsh and gets in the way. I think a smarter balancing of how much influence certain actions dole out could have also been better in the long run. Maybe dumping a hatchet into the supply locker shouldn't net you the same amount of influence calling in an airstrike costs you, but what do I know? Maybe they just really liked that hatchet. The elephant in the room throughout this video has probably been base management. It's come up a few times throughout each section and I've been putting it off until right now. The core of your community is your base of operations, your home site as the game calls it. The home site is where the player's community lives. It's where you'll deposit items, park your cars, pick up a handful of missions, and so on. You get the deal. Home sites can be designated at specific locations throughout Trumbull Valley. There's a total of 8 you can decide to live out throughout the main campaign. They each come with defensive walls around the perimeter and predetermined facilities that may or may not be removed, with additional facility slots for the player to decide what is built, allowing for some customization and personalization to your home site. Throughout the main story, you're given one real home site at the start of the game, the Church of the Ascension. You're later pushed to move to a bigger, more centralized location in the story, but you don't necessarily have to. I chose to move because the church has a few built-in facilities, entirely restricting what facilities you can have in the home site, with very few open slots for me to choose from. Granted, the built-in facilities are mostly the essentials you should always have: a bedroom for survivors to sleep in, a watchtower to deal with approaching Zeds, and a medical area to help injured survivors recover. But I wanted more, you know? Manifest, destiny, and all that. I mentioned it in the story section, but I chose to relocate to the Snyder Trucking Warehouse, a large home site with 6 open facility slots that I could fill to my heart's content. Speaking of facilities, let's dig into what they are and what they can do for you. Bear with me for a second, we're gonna go through a lot of logistical stuff pretty quickly. Let's start with the essentials, the ones you should probably always build. First off, sleeping areas, which can be upgraded to bedrooms, bunkhouses, and barracks, each giving more and more beds for survivors. These are places designated for survivors to sleep in. Crazy concept, right? Having a bedroom in your home site is vital to restoring survivors from the tired state. On the other side of that same coin, a medical area is required to help survivors recover from the injured state. They can also be used to craft medical supplies like painkillers and stimulants to help recover health and stamina while a survivor is out in the field. You can upgrade the medical area to an infirmary and even a medical lab with the right prerequisites, capable of helping survivors recover even faster and making stronger drugs. Next, you probably want to make sure you have a workshop. These increase the construction speed of other facilities and maybe outposts, and repair any weapons in your storage. Upgrading the workshop allows you to repair cars and construct things even faster. The workshops can be upgraded even further to repair cars more thoroughly and allow you to craft improvised explosives. Again, all of these higher tier upgrades require you to have some prerequisites, like already having a specific facility in your home site or having a survivor with the appropriate skills to operate the facility. The last essential facility, you could technically live without it, is the Watchtower. It's a pretty straightforward facility. As I mentioned earlier, it positions a survivor in a tower to be able to deal with approaching threats. It can be upgraded to a shooting platform to give you the ability to raise the shooting skill of survivors in your community without having to play as them yourself. With the essentials out of the way, we can talk about other facilities. First off, we have the cooking area. It sets up a kitchen to cook and store food. You can spend supplies and influence to give your community temporary buffs or prepare some consumables for the player. There's also a dining area you can build. I think it's just to manage survivor attitude and morale, not much more to it. You can designate a facility to be a gardening area. It generates food supplies daily, slowly becoming more bountiful the longer you have the facility in your home site. There's the training area facility. This gives you benefits to your survivors' stamina and increase their fighting XP gains. I think it also enables you to train other survivors too. I had a couple missions pop up asking me to help weaker survivors learn to fight by training them in the field. You can also opt into building a storage facility, increasing the amount of materials you can store at your home base. I was occasionally alerted to exceeding the maximum allotted storage for food and medicine, I think. I know in the game it just meant that I wasn't able to deposit the max amount of supplies in a rucksack, but hey, that sounds like a good problem to have in the apocalypse. You can upgrade storage areas to allow for even more storage space and prevent food from spoiling, slowing the daily decay rate. Finally, you can build a library. Two of the benefits of a library require you to have a survivor with specific skills, and both of those benefits from the library aren't very good. You can increase your Wits XP gain, arguably the weakest skill in the game, and it allows you to build some other facilities that are otherwise inaccessible. The other benefit of the library is research, which is mostly useless unless you're planning on playing the game very long term. Research lets you learn how to create advanced items, like learning how to create better explosives or being able to craft your own ammo. And that's it for facilities. I said that word a lot in this section, I apologize, but I'm gonna say it a few more times anyways. Facilities are integral to the experience of making a home site your own. Your home site can vary from mine even if you pick the same location, because maybe you'd prioritize having a garden to help with food supplies, while I chose to build a training area so I could level up my survivors faster. Maybe you don't want to move into a larger home site, instead of opting to have more built-in facility slots because you don't want to engage with the management system. And I think that's all great. I think it's important to have some player expression somewhere in games, and this, along with the characters you play as, is where it shines. You can tailor your base to your needs or wants, and no one can stop you. The daily influence cap based on fame can stop you, but no one other than that can, I promise. The last components of your home site are outposts. Outposts serve as pockets of safety away from home. You can designate almost any building in Trumbull Valley as an outpost, and doing so gives you a number of benefits. Inside each outpost, a supply locker will spawn, letting you access your community's resources and supplies while away from home. Every outpost also provides a safe area around the building. I think this lessens zombie spawn rates immediately, but you're also able to set up traps to ensure the safe area gets cleared periodically. These are solely a behind-the-scenes numbers thing though. I was hoping to see these traps in action while I walked through town, but I'm pretty sure it just makes zombies spawn even less. The last real benefit of outposts is that they can provide material resources. If you choose to create an outpost in a building that would otherwise provide you with materials for your home site, it can generate those resources for you every day without you having to go collect them. So say you designate a restaurant as an outpost, you'll get food every day. Set up an outpost in a pharmacy, you'll get free medicine. You get the idea. I really like the outpost system on paper. Making safe houses away from home is engaging and fun, but I feel like they don't really do enough. Sure, it lessens zombie spawns. Again, I only think it does this. The game tells you outposts make the area safer, and it did seem like less were around. But I wish there was more of a physical impact with laying claim to a building or area. It'd be cool if those traps you could set up actually put down spiked walls, or maybe a minefield in the road where you have to remember to avoid them yourself. I like how lived-in home sites become. You'll have these ramshackle defenses around the base, and each room gets some new assets to represent facilities assigned to them. I guess I wish outposts did something similar. As it stands, all that changes is a supply locker spawns somewhere in the building. It'd be interesting to see that the building gets its windows boarded up, or maybe nearby car pileups in the street get cleared, or even if the interior just cleaned up a little bit. Maybe I'm asking too much, but it was definitely a bit of a letdown for me personally when there was no visible change to the area. As a bonus, if you're wondering how I decided to place my outposts, I prioritized buildings in the immediate area around my home site, the warehouse, to create a blanket of safety on the east side of the town of Marshall, I think. I picked some resource buildings, but otherwise it was mostly about canvassing the area to make sure my base had less of a chance to be attacked. And again, I think that was working. As a whole, base management in State of Decay thrives as much as you engage with it. You can neglect building a library to get higher tier facilities and it won't affect you much. But you can build that library and open up a world of research and crafting. You can turn your home site into an industrial complex, pumping out supplies, materials, and food, or you can run it like boot camp, prioritizing the fighting experience of your survivors. Base management is all up to you and your preferences and what you want out of the experience. It's one of the cores of the game, again if you want it to be, and it helps State of Decay stay ever present in my mind. I would daydream at school about where to build an outpost, or if I needed to move my home site and how that affect my community. I think base management added a lot of staying power for State of Decay, and helped make the game feel more unique at the time. Missions in State of Decay are pretty simple, thankfully, after everything else we've covered so far. They come in two flavors, story missions and side missions. Story missions are just that. They are missions within the story that progress the main narrative of the base game. Their objectives and gameplay don't differ much from side missions. The only distinguishable difference between the two mission types are that you'll usually get unique dialogue from Lily over the radio about the mission, and you might get a brief cutscene before the mission or once you've completed it. Story missions appear in a linear order, and you've already heard about that order in the story section of the video. There are a finite number of story missions in the game, a little over 30 by my count. There's a blurred line between a few side missions and story missions, so I don't think my exact count is accurate. Like, I don't think the long backtracking mission for Lily is mandatory, but it is a story mission. Sometimes story missions progress the state of the world, or at least how the world is being presented to the player. As you progress, you unlock new regions of Trumbull Valley, and with that, you're notified of more special infected appearing or being newly present. I could have sworn I saw a Juggernaut zombie before the game told me I was expecting them, same with a feral zombie now that I'm writing this, but I'm not certain. Side missions are presented to the player dynamically. Someone in the world needs X amount of materials, or a community member is in need of your help to clear an infestation. These missions pop up frequently and constantly. You will be bombarded with the amount of side missions the game throws at you. There is next to no downtime in a casual playthrough of the campaign. And by casual, I mean just playing through the story missions, trying to keep things from falling apart, not min-maxing every aspect. These missions are also on a timer. If you don't complete them soon enough, they'll automatically fail and there will be consequences for failing them. The consequences can be minor things, like losing a little trust with a friendly community, or as severe as survivors of your community outright dying. So these missions are constantly coming through the radio, they're all over the map, and they're on a time limit. This creates a near schizophrenic experience, jumping between objectives sometimes. You finish one supply run for your neighbors. Suddenly, your favorite backup survivor is stuck in an infestation. It didn't get to the point that it annoyed me or frustrated me, but every time a new mission poured in while I was on my way to my own goal, I'd usually roll my eyes or sigh and start heading towards it. So what do you do in these missions? What are they like? How do they play out? Well, they're extremely easy to describe, with little to no variety. In fact, let's play a little game if you can decide if a mission is a story mission or a side mission. Example 1. Someone wants you to get some supplies from a building and deliver it to them. Answer: both, story and side mission. Example 2. Someone wants your help to get them from point A to point B, making sure they arrive safely. Answer: both, story and side mission. Example 3. Someone wants you to help them clear an infestation nearby or kill a special infected in the area. Answer: both, story and side mission. Exciting stuff, right? Even the side content has the quality of the main story. Or do the story missions have such little depth that they feel like filler content with tiny bits of dialogue in between? I'm not trying to just be reductive here. I know you could do this with any game's content, just describe them in the most bare bones way possible, but I really want to emphasize how safe State of Decay plays with its supposed main missions. I guess it's up to your tastes and how deep and complicated you like your quest design in games, but I really wish the story had made some effort or tweaks or twists to the gameplay. Maybe failing or denying the Wilkerson missions turns them into an enemy faction, creating hostile survivors on the map. Maybe a story mission could have you clearing a super infestation, a large building with a huge amount of special infected. Or maybe the story missions could properly introduce the special infected at all, instead of there just being a tooltip telling you, hey, they're here now. It feels like the story in State of Decay was an afterthought, like someone decided one day, what if not everyone likes playing a sandbox? There should be an end to the game, right? And after some discussion, they decided a simple story would be a natural out for players looking for some conclusion. Kind of makes sense now that I write it out, when the original idea for State of Decay was a massively multiplayer experience. I didn't really know where else to talk about this aspect of State of Decay, the real-time effects that occur while you're not logged onto the game. This feature honestly just frustrates me more than anything, and poking around a little online, it seems like that's the case for most people who played the game. They even removed these systems entirely in the sequel. In short, the game continues to simulate what would happen to your community while the game is closed. Rather, it simulates what would have happened when you boot up the save again, but you know what I mean. So what does this mean for the player? Well, it kind of just punishes you for not logging on every day. Over your inactive time, your community's supplies dwindle. Your survivors can get sick and die, or just run away and go missing, while more and more hordes and infestations come up on the map. From what I've read online, apparently the first 72 hours you don't log onto the game, that's when the most damage is dealt to your community. After that, it calms down and deals out the misery at a slower pace. Again, this just seems like it's punishing the player for not checking in on their little video game every day, making the game feel like a chore. I can understand the simulation aspect of this, I think it is interesting on paper, but from my experience it just feels like punishment. I guess I should get into specifics on how this system negatively impacted me while making this video. Once I stopped playing the game for my initial recording and started writing this script, there was a 3-day gap between me finishing the final mission and me booting up the game again for some background footage. I started the game up and noticed a member of my community was labeled as missing. Oh well, I didn't play as them and they weren't integral to any facility. That sucks that I couldn't do anything, but whatever. The next day I launched the game again, no real harm done to my community, all is good. I take a break for a day or two writing the script and recording and then log in the day after that. Suddenly, Marcus Campbell is missing from my character list, presumed dead. Alright, sure, my main and strongest survivor is gone. That sucks, but I'm just getting extra footage now. Oh, Maya Torres is missing now too, my second in command. Cool. Oh, we're out of construction materials, low on ammo and fuel, but hey, morale in the community is still about 65% positive, and food and medicine are still stocked. This continued to dwindle and spiral further out of control, with more survivors dying or going missing, supplies getting more depreciated and running out as I continued to log on occasionally for extra footage. If you don't have this video on your second monitor, yes, I am calling you out. You might have noticed this if you were looking for it. While I was rambling during some sections, it's pretty obvious during some B-roll. How and why is this a fun or logical or incentivizing component of the game? I didn't play for a couple of days. Suddenly my community has lost 2 of its strongest members and 3 of the 5 supplies we need to survive are completely boned? I know this is a hyper-focused case of the real-time elements impacting me negatively. I played consistently for a few days and then logged on sporadically over the course of a few weeks. I happen to play the game often during my playthrough, but not everyone would have that luxury. People have a life outside of this game. People want to play other games. I don't see why there needed to be such harsh consequences for not playing constantly. And I guess Undead Labs agreed because again, this isn't in State of Decay 2. I know this is coming from a 2024 mindset of the general video game zeitgeist right now, a world of daily challenges and battle passes, but it really feels like an early, kinda predatory mechanic in an otherwise pretty lax and fun game. It feels like they wanted people to keep playing State of Decay constantly, not really in a way to make the game feel like an active, living simulation as something like Animal Crossing might, but more in a way to force you spending time on the game, checking in to do your daily apocalypse chores. The overall look and presentation isn't exactly a selling point for State of Decay. It was a smaller budget game made by a smaller team for the Xbox 360 in 2013. You can't expect much from it. But I think Undead Labs really helped themselves in the long run with the charm they put into the user interface, or UI, and the overall art style of the game. State of Decay doesn't strive for ultra-realism like many games did and still do, instead opting for a more cartoony look with exaggerated, animated, and simple character designs. The game has a nice orange color palette during the day, dressing the game with warmer colors in the environment and lighting. Things almost look pleasant in the game. It looks like an eternal fall season in a picturesque rural town, if you can ignore the destruction and carnage all over the place. At night, the game gets washed over with a blue-green energy, as a lot of games tend to do to help sell the darkness and cold of night. Both times of day look and mesh well with the art style in the game, kind of helping sell that cartoonish vibe. Characters aren't very high fidelity, but again, they also don't strive for realism or to be taken too seriously. Their survivors have slightly exaggerated features and simple silhouettes. They look human, and that seems to be all they were going for. Zombies, on the other hand, look a little more intense, with glowing eyes at night and visible blood and damage to their bodies while still maintaining a cartoonish look. A quick aside about the design for the zombies, the gore system looks great and is impressive for the time. A lot of games now harp on having believable gore and destruction to the body, which can be cool, I won't detract from that, but I feel like State of Decay was a little ahead of the game. You can chop off limbs, leave huge lashes on their bodies, and blast entire holes through them. It's fun in that weird zombie gore fixation kinda way. Continuing with aspects of the presentation that I liked, I love how the UI looks in this game. I love a good diegetic menu, meaning the UI and elements of it exist mostly in universe that our characters could or would see, and State of Decay delivers on that front for me. The first thing you'll probably notice this with is the journal. This is a physical journal that the survivors will pull out in-game, and then it's displayed for the player in a believable, in-universe way. It looks like a notebook, with loose pages scrapped together and pasted or taped into the book. Your inventory is on graph paper, the skills section looks like it's a loose piece of paper that just got plastered onto the character page. Your home site shows your base in a simplified blueprint, all with their own little dividers poking out of the side of the notebook. It's cute, and it just shows some attention and love went into the design of the UI and how it's going to be shown to the player. A similar decision was made for the in-game map. It's a tourist map you'd seemingly find at the in-world gas station Bronto Gas. It has a legend on the side for your usual public infrastructure like banks and police stations. It has little factoids about Trumbull Valley you can read, plenty of advertisement space for Bronto Gas, complete with the crumples and folds a piece of paper would gain from heavy use. Again, it's just fun and shows someone cared enough to design it this way and had a cohesive design philosophy throughout. The HUD or heads-up display in the game is pretty minimalistic, and I like that. At any given time, you have a small mini-map in the bottom left corner, with 2 bars on each side, stamina on the left and health on the right. They all have a simplistic, easily readable design that tells you just enough information. The minimap zooms out a bit to show you more of the surrounding area when you're in a car, moving fast. It populates map elements when you're close enough, and those elements are easily legible in the minimap. It all gets the job done. Your consumables are tracked right next to your health bar with an icon and a number indicating how many you have left. You might have a little scrap of paper under the map telling you your current objective, and I like that too. It continues the philosophy of the journal menus in a small but effective way. When you get updates in the HUD, they come up in each upper corner, filling up some pretty big space in the real estate on screen. Community updates pop up in the left-hand side. They kinda look like bookmarks to me, which makes sense for keeping tabs in a journal. Maybe I'm extrapolating a bit there though. Underneath the bookmark, you get some quick updates about your community when you enter your base while you're at home. In the top right side of the screen, world updates and tooltips appear. These come up in a mostly translucent window to give you a brief update about what's going on in your world or to quickly introduce a new mechanic you may want to explore. Additionally, some more immediate emergent updates will pop up here when you're clearing out a building or alert a horde of zombies, stuff like that. All of these elements are serviceable, they get the job done, and I can't complain with how they're presented. They don't do anything special, but they aren't offensive to me in any way. As for UI elements I don't really care for, there's only one that comes to mind while I was playing through the game. There is a huge influx of tutorials with new information being pumped out for the player to read when you first open the journal. And I get it, there's a lot of buttons to click, there's a lot of little icons, there's a lot of things to explain. But the game just forces them onto the player, taking up a quarter of the screen, distracting them from the journal UI to begin with. I think a better way to handle this would have been bringing up smaller prompts to notify the player that there is a tutorial available in the pause menu or elsewhere if the player wants to fully grasp what they're looking at. Some things I can't really defend for how the game looks. It's an 11-year-old game and it definitely shows now. I'm not disparaging the game here or anything. I don't want anyone to think I have a lesser opinion of State of Decay just because it's a few years older now and it might need some Botox or a facelift. To start, models have a constant, inconsistent level of detail. The rendering doesn't seem to keep up with the player moving through the world, so textures and models can look really low quality if you just drove to their area on the map. The LOD, or level of detail, catches up most of the time, but if it's a quick chat with a survivor, you might be staring at a super low poly model for a couple seconds, and it's just kind of bad show. But generally speaking, textures and models look pretty clear and they aren't distracting in any way while playing. The camera can be super awkward while playing though, and it can get stuck in the environment pretty often, especially when the game tries to do an action shot of a finisher on a zombie. This always leaves a bad taste. Something I immediately noticed when I got control in the game was constant flickering shadows in the player's immediate view. I don't really know why this is happening. I'm not a tech or environmental artist, so I couldn't tell you why it's happening systemically, but man, it looks bad. This persisted the entire game. I think my brain just tuned it out after a while and it wasn't that noticeable during the night. So I mean, whatever, right? It's just an annoying visual bug. There are a couple mods online to remove shadows entirely, and I imagine it's solely because of this issue, funnily enough. Moving on to animations, conversations in the game feel extremely stilted and awkward. Two characters face each other and snap to face other characters if they speak. Their mouths hardly move and they only have a handful of canned animations for their bodies during dialogue. I noticed the same distressed outburst animation in dialogue every time it happened. Interestingly, you have full camera control during dialogue sequences and you can just watch your character's face not animate whatsoever while speaking. It just feels dated and I don't know why they let you see that. Outside of dialogue though, I think the animations look great for the most part. Characters move in exaggerated but believable ways with big heaving jumps, heavy purposeful stomps when they sprint, and fluid movement into crouched positions. Melee animations, while limited in their variety, are very satisfying to watch. Weapons collide with zombies in a satisfying thunk, and they react effectively, getting slapped around or falling to the ground. The finisher animations were always fun to watch, big hefty attacks that result in a gory splat. Occasionally you can get snapped into a canned animation like when you get grappled, and that can look pretty awkward and feel bad to control. But the energetic grab from the zombie and their grip releasing once the player is free look good enough that I'd usually forget about the awkward initiation. Animations for guns are definitely a weak spot. I don't think there's any movement on a model of a gun while you're firing. Shells and casings eject, which is cool, but they're pretty stiff in motion. Reloading especially looks off if you pay closer attention. Magazines aren't ejected and characters never have another magazine or shells to place into the gun, they kinda just wave those parts away. Again, I know a lot of these are conveniences and details we can afford with more modern titles. These are just more so things I noticed that seemed off or were kind of in bad show. Oh, one more tiny little hiccup I want to mention. This isn't a slight to the game, it didn't affect anything, but it always boots in this tiny sliver of a window until it reaches the main menu. It's really goofy and I don't know, it's just kinda crazy this passed some kind of certification. Look, I'm not gonna pretend I'm an audio engineer, you can probably tell by the audio in this video, and I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about music, in games or in general, but I will tell you what I thought about what's in this game and how I feel about their implementation. Sound effects throughout the game felt spot on to me. Melee weapons thunked onto or sliced through decayed meat.
The time's not exactly on our side, if you know what I mean.
Cars revved and skirted when appropriate.
On the move. I hear ya.
Footsteps matched the materials the foots were stepping on. It all felt pretty par for the course. Again, it was serviceable. Something I immediately noticed was how loud guns are. Now, guns are loud in real life, duh, but these guns felt like they were punching through the sound barrier into my eardrums sometimes. I don't need that level of immersion for this game, man. That's my only real complaint about sound effects, honestly. They were spot on in their timing, the positioning felt realistic enough, everything was a-okay. As for the music in the game, you've actually been listening to it throughout this video, whoa. I really enjoyed the tracks that I heard while playing. I even listened to them occasionally while writing the script for this video. The game has 3 moods I think it strikes really well with the soundtrack. The first being overwhelming dread and sad times in the apocalypse. The second is what I'm calling folk survival. It feels like you're thriving in the rural setting, someone just got their guitar out and they want to make everyone feel a little better about tomorrow. The third is kind of an ambient droning, setting an underlying serious tone to what might be going on. The music is context sensitive to what the player is doing. It'll bust out the twangy guitar when the sun rises on a new day, and stick to a lighter mood if you're hanging out at your home site, while picking up the pace and swapping tones to something heavier while you're being chased or in combat. The soundtrack was directed and composed in collaboration by Jesper Kyd, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Drasic? Drask? Sorry. You might be familiar with Jesper Kyd's work in other games. He's credited with composing the first 4 Assassin's Creed games, the Borderlands games, and a few of the earlier Hitman titles, making a pretty impressive catch for State of Decay, and thankfully I think it paid off. Again, the tracks fit the tone and vibe of the game, and when they're playing contextually, they strike the right chord for what the player might be doing. All in all, a very solid soundtrack in a game that probably could have skirted by without it. So that's it. We're at my closing remarks, and I want to try to answer the question I posed at the beginning of the video. What made State of Decay stick in my memory since I first played it over a decade ago, and does it deserve that spot lodged in my mind? I can answer that first part pretty succinctly, though I think this section is going to be more about my personal experience then, rather than my opinion now. State of Decay has a fun progression system and role-playing elements that appealed to me then and are still kind of fun to engage with now. With those systems, it made characters feel more like they're your own, with a large cast of characters even, with you controlling a majority of them and your decisions determining their success and even their survival. On top of that, I had my home site to consider, your safe haven in the apocalypse. You get to customize this, albeit to a very limited degree, but it felt like it was important and the home site always gave me motivation to keep playing back then. It was an outlier in zombie games to me then. It gave me a sandbox and expected me to figure out how to survive in it, rather than being a shooter or relying on a more arcadey formula. I felt like the community was mine and that I needed to care about what happened to the characters in it. It was different for me at the time. It doesn't hit that exact note nowadays with even more games on the scene, but that didn't matter to me then. I played State of Decay and I was hooked. Now for the second part of that question, does it deserve having that grip on my memory? That's where I think my opinion of the game now comes in, and it gets a little messy. I just mentioned what I still enjoyed. The characters are still fun to level up, and the base management is still enjoyable to a degree, but that's kind of where my rose-tinted glasses fall off. State of Decay is not a satisfying game to play through. The story missions are extremely underwhelming, the narrative in the missions with the characters and the world is near non-existent, and while playing through them it feels more like busy work comparable to the rest of the game's missions. Characters seem like they have some personality and uniqueness to them, but they all become mostly the same with the progression that is available for them. They'll all have a lot of health, a lot of stamina, they'll all be able to search things really fast and shoot guns pretty accurately. Sure, you can pick a specialization, but half of them are worthless and the melee weapons don't give you enough variety to warrant mixing things up. Not that the game throws any level of difficulty at you to encourage you to mix it up. The quickest way through the game is just whacking through zombies or shooting them when whacking isn't working. There is no reason for you to ever need to use stealth. I wish there was. The joke skills and traits are fun, even still it's funny to see that your character was a sleaze and that gives them the flirty trait, but the novelty wears off quickly over time. The economy with influence is a mess, and is made completely pointless by an arbitrary feign stat. Your base is pretty easy to manage, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to keep materials high and everyone happy. That is, until you don't log on for a few days and everything goes to hell. I really dislike the real-time elements of this game. They honestly, truly ruin the casual experience of playing the game and should have been something to opt into. I don't want to harp on an older game for how it looks, but the graphical bugs still in the release of this game, the re-release with a year full of updates, worsen the experience and can put some people off. Again, I want to overstate that it doesn't detract much for me, but they are worth noting. So, does State of Decay deserve a fond memory or two? Sure. If you go back and play any game from your childhood, you'll see some new cracks and flaws that you didn't notice or were more willing to ignore then. I'm glad I played through this game again with a more critical look. I don't think as highly of it as I once did. In fact, I don't know if I'd even recommend playing the base game and its main campaign. But I get why I felt that way as a kid, and I'm glad I can see its true value now more clearly as an adult. State of Decay is a very flawed game, but it's a game I remember and a game I probably won't be forgetting anytime soon. Hey, you're still watching, so I'm gonna keep talking here for a second. There's a couple things I want to address that you might have thought while watching the video, or now that you're at the end of the video, and I just kind of want to shoot from the hip and talk about them casually, I guess, without a script. We'll see how that goes. So first and foremost, if you are a fan of State of Decay, you might be wondering why I didn't talk about the two DLCs, Breakdown and Lifeline. I mentioned them at the top of the video, and they just kinda never came up again. And that's mainly because the thrust of this video was me revisiting a game I've thought about for 10 years, you know? I played this as a kid, as I've stated a couple times. And as a kid, I was broke and did not have the money to buy the DLCs. So they weren't really relevant for this video. I might come back and talk about them someday. They do interest me. I know, I think Breakdown is more of a sandbox, kind of like State of Decay 2, and I don't really know much about Lifeline. But that does lead me into the other thing you might be wondering. Am I gonna talk about State of Decay 2 after this? And the answer to that is probably not. Similar answer or reasoning for the first question. I don't really feel a need to revisit that game. I've played State of Decay 2 a lot, and I've played it pretty recently. I was playing it last year. I think State of Decay 2, just to throw out quick thoughts about it, I think State of Decay 2 is a better game. It leans in on the sandbox a lot more. I don't think it even has a main narrative. I think it might in the tutorial, but past that, and the Heartland update, I think, it's just kind of full sandbox, which I think fits this genre of zombie simulation kind of thing a lot better. Those were the two things that I thought that maybe someone watching this would think of while watching the video or reaching the end if you're a fan of these games. Lastly, I want to give a thank you to two people, specifically my partner, Jen. Thank you very much for being supportive and reading the script whenever I asked you to, and looking at the editing or whatever I asked you to help me out with or give your opinion on. You were very supportive and very sweet throughout the entire thing, and I am very appreciative. And secondly, I want to say a thank you to Natalia, one of my closest friends. Thanks for mostly the same, you know? You were very supportive. I would send you little updates, and you were hyping me up the whole time, so that was nice to have. Thank you to both of you. And a little extra thank you to anyone I sent a preview to over the last couple weeks or however long I've been working on this. You were probably very nice about it, and I am very appreciative of that because I need validation all the time. And thank you very much to you, whoever you are, still watching this video, 3 minutes deep into me rambling after it technically ended. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. This is my first time trying any of this stuff with, I don't know, writing a script, editing, formulating cohesive thoughts about a game past it's good or I like it. And I hope to see you on the next project or whatever I upload. I have something cooking, something I'm working on, so stay tuned, and I hope to see you there. And of course, one last time, thank you very, very much for watching.